Hey everyone, welcome to Altitude. Of course, I'm Woody Woodworth. Super phenomenal show today. Thanks for joining. I have two very special guests on the show today. Jason Gervickas, who is going to be co-host, and Matt Simpson, who is EVP of Business Development and Channel for Megaport. Gentlemen, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Woody. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. So for today's show, we're going to talk all about the edge and what the new edge looks like, what the new edge might turn into, changes and topologies of edge technology through the guided vision of Matt at Megaport. Megaport being one of the biggest cloud connectivity and service connectivity providers in the world, and a company that I myself very fond of because I did a lot of business and development with Megaport when I was back at Azure in my old chair as a black belt. They were a critical partner of Azure. So
it's always great seeing you, Woody, and Jason. It's great to sort of work with you over the last couple of months.
Yeah, phenomenal meeting you, Matt. Woody, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
So, Matt, I knew that you had a background, like so many of us on this show, that did not originate in technology or networking for that matter, but rather something quite different. So do you want to tell the guests a little bit about that and how you transitioned from one side to the other?
Yeah, so my background is actually from hotels and resorts, funnily enough. So I've been at Megaport pretty much since day one, so just over 10 years. But when I first sort of started at Megaport, I actually met with the founder, Bevan Slattery. And that was an introduction through my brother, who was running and operating a hosting business. So he was a partner and a customer of Bevan Slattery's companies that he built data centers and subsea cables. And so he was buying capacity through some of those companies that he had sort of founded. And when I caught up with Bevan, Megaport was really only a concept. We'd been talking to a couple of customers, but we weren't really generating revenue at the time. And when I met with him, it was like, I was totally bought into this vision. And this vision was building a company where you could easily connect any particular service or cloud environment, regardless of where you're actually hosted. 10 years ago, cloud really wasn't a thing then. People were connecting via the internet, and Direct Connect or ExpressRoute as well wasn't really a thing either. So I said, Bevan, I believe in this vision. I'll take any role that you've got. You know, I'm sort of done with hospitality and hotels. So rather than filling occupancy or rooms, I'm now filling capacity from a network perspective. So very, very sort of similar in terms of skill set, but a completely different sort of industry and background. And it's been one great journey and ride, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to come from that hospitality space, jumping over into a technical role, which is interesting all in itself. How did you find the transition and learning some of the technology and making it part of your core career?
I mean, from the outside looking in, it probably looks a little daunting, and it was a bit daunting. It was certainly a challenging role, but it was an exciting part. I think the really interesting part and the opportunity that I actually had, particularly when I first started at Megaport, was sitting right next to the founding engineers and network engineers. So I learned very quickly about how networking works, the different types of layers. And then, of course, we didn't have a solutions architect team. We didn't have a marketing team. So I had to really quickly learn the technology and then clearly articulate it back to not only partners, but also customers. And as I sort of mentioned earlier, and Woody, I mean, you experienced this firsthand as well. Private connectivity really wasn't a thing 10 years ago. People were like, sure, that's a premium. I don't really need that now. 10 years later, it's a completely different story. The market is extremely educated around dedicated and private connectivity.
Yeah, that's right. I just did a recent podcast with Doug Merritt, the CEO of Aviatrix, of course. And he and I were talking about the rise of the network and the consciousness of the business leaders. So when cloud was first born, of course, it wasn't really centered around business critical applications, but rather those DevOps opportunities that developers were looking to capitalize on to get free of the shackles of IT. So it wasn't like core business. It was more like, I don't want to say pet projects and skunkwork things, but they were auxiliary projects and other things that needed agility that were not central to the brain of business, right? It was kind of a playground, if you will. And the connectivity model was just spin up a VPN. And when cloud first started, there wasn't really a concept on either side, on the provider side or the customer consumer side, that VPN wouldn't be sufficient, that there would need to be other means of communicating. But suddenly enterprise grows up in cloud, it gets serious, they start moving business critical applications, and then private connectivity takes off like a rocket because, of course, enterprise needs private connectivity to solve some of these big challenges that the internet and VPN just simply couldn't solve for them. So it's been an amazing journey to be on, to see how the growth of cloud connectivity mirrors or is tightly coupled with the growth of business consumption of cloud, but also enterprise understanding of the criticality of networking to their cloud workloads, and how that private connectivity is married to the seriousness of cloud for businesses. I think it's a really cool relationship.
Exactly, Woody. When I, in my previous role coming over to Aviatrix, we talked a lot about data gravity, right? And where that data lives. I think that's where the turning point happened. You had all of these applications being developed in the cloud. They're very agile. Like you said, Skunkworks, Shadow IT, but they were very agile in the cloud. They could run things very differently than they were doing in on-prem, and how quickly they could spin these applications up and get things moving. But then all of a sudden, the data was no longer near the application. They're like, now we have to get back to that data that's on-prem. So how are we going to do this? And boom, the advent of Direct Connect, ExpressRoute, the Megaports of the world come into play, right? And how do you make that connectivity fast to be able to grab that data and push it either up into the cloud or at least connect to that data?
I think it's a really interesting point that you make there, Jason. And I think the data continues to be very disparate. It's very fragmented, and depending on, whether you're an enterprise or whether you're a managed service provider, it's very hard to assume what the future looks like and where it's going to be actually hosted. During that evolution, everyone was like, yes, I need all in and cloud. Now they're kind of pulling back a little. They're doing a little bit of hybrid, right? They're doing a little on-prem or co-location mixed with cloud. And now you have GPU providers coming in and really sort of disrupting sort of the hyperscalers and the cloud providers. And so you're seeing more independent providers coming into the mix. And so now the networking out of anything is becoming a little bit more complex. So how do you simplify that, and how do you make it easier, and how do you provide that agility in the networking component?
Yeah, absolutely. The first private connectivity patterns were at best an exercise in controlled chaos, right? In the very beginning. And everyone would hope and pray that would work when you first turned it on, and everyone would celebrate and jump up and down when it did, and then stress out and freak out when it didn't. And we've definitely come a long way since those days. Matt, tell me a little bit about the journey of Megaport as, one of the bigger connectivity providers for enterprise to cloud. When you first joined, did you expect that it would be, this amazing critical service that enterprises would end up depending upon? Did you see this in the future, or was it more of, let's just start this thing and see where it goes?
I mean, we were pretty excited. I think when I first started, I was looking after one particular little regional area of Queensland, Australia. And for me, it was like, wouldn't it be great if I could look after maybe Australia and then maybe tap into New Zealand? And we exploded, moved into Asia Pacific and expanded into Singapore and then Hong Kong. And we're like, great, we're going to disrupt all of Asia Pacific, and that's really going to be our sweet spot. And then one day we were like, why don't we tackle the US? And then it just exploded. So now it's like 25 countries. We're continuing to expand. At one point we were rolling out to 25 to 30 data centers a quarter. It was just phenomenal and so exciting. I was literally living on a plane. So was my colleagues, but just was an incredible journey and still is. It just feels like we're back in that sort of growth mode again. And it's really more around the evolution of some of the technology that's coming through. But our vision and our foundation really hasn't sort of changed. It's more about how do we build the ecosystem and how do we stack that ecosystem.
Matt, I'm curious, with regards to the explosion that you're seeing, I'm sure there's some peaks and valleys over the years that you've been with Megaport. Are you seeing an explosion or more of a growth pattern right now due to the AI LLM aspects of where we're going with data?
Yeah, that one I think is a really interesting question because we are certainly preparing for this big wave that everyone's sort of talking about. We're still waiting, I think, but the capacity requirements, and I'm sure this is for any sort of particular carrier out there, the capacity requirements are pretty extraordinary. Like,
right.
Once where, customers were asking for sort of 10 gig, it's now, hey, I need 100 gigs or I need 400 gigs. So the pipes are just even bigger and the capacity requirements are getting even larger. It's funny how cyclical this is all becoming because the AI wave that we're feeling, and I don't know whether you're feeling it as well, but it's very similar to the adoption of cloud 10 years ago. And so everyone's like, I need to get in, but I'm not really too sure of how I'm going to actually manage it. But we're going to test it out, but I'm going to make sure that I can build a solid foundation. So everyone's sort of, hey, I need this, but they're still a little uncertain to what it's going to look like probably in a year's time. I think it'd be really interesting to catch up in a year and see what it really looks like.
One of the things I'm very interested to see is, how the actual implementation of AI and LLMs really become proliferated through the enterprise and how they're going to make use of them. Is it going to be cloud providers that are able to provide that service to them, or are there going to be more enterprises who invest on the AI LLM platforms in their own facilities, which is not an easy thing to do as an enterprise. If you look at some of the core requirements around the GPUs, the core network requirements from a storage perspective, and then you look at it in the front end of for the actual network connectivity, like you said, we're talking 400, 800 gig now on the front end of these data centers. That is one of the things that is going to be very interesting to see over the next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, a lot of enterprises are probably running and training internally or privately, right? And I think once they make it publicly available, also everyone's thinking about, well, these are intensive workloads. They require a huge amount of cooling and power to run and operate. And of course, it's extremely expensive. Similar to, and sorry, I sound like a broken record, but similar to like 10 years ago, I feel like the enterprise really hasn't thought about the network and how that's going to be managed. And we're in, I would say, an early adoption stage from what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
That's for sure. And some of the providers haven't really figured out the network themselves. They're just building these backbones, but really it's, okay, well, how are these users going to interact? And I think that's probably where it comes into the edge as being, it's certainly evolving as well. A couple of years ago, there was a few providers building out these, what you'd call like micro data centers, but some of them have pulled back, and the larger providers like your Equinix and Digital are going to more regional areas, but they don't need to have the compute right at the edge. But the objective the vision or the objective hasn't changed. It's how do I get closer to the user?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a couple of comments and thoughts there, just Woody's predictions for the future. I think in terms of the locality of the actual LLM brain trust, if you will, the specialized chips that are able to do all the data analysis and pattern recognition and all the heavy duty stuff that requires the front end AI shim to be productive. You have to follow the money on those chips, right? They're very bespoke. Like you said, Matt, they require tremendous amount of power and cooling. They're driving up energy demands everywhere they go. So there are only going to be a handful of companies that have the capital to invest at scale to commoditize that into a service. So obviously cloud providers, NVIDIA, obviously they're one of the predominant, if not the predominant right now, chip makers. They are likely going to have, if they don't already, and I should pay attention to this, but I'm so into networking, sometimes I don't. They do
Me
have,
too.
in fact, their own AI stack that can go in carrier neutral facilities and stuff. And we're likely to see that expand. And that
Yeah.
will probably predominate for a good long while. But as we know, the market never stands still, innovation never stands still. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a new generation of AI chips, kind of like ARM came out against Intel, right? That are faster, smaller, cheaper, less power, that are easier to commoditize into smaller form factors. Then we'll see businesses starting to build these out in different locations, maybe in data centers, but I think mostly the edge and other places where their central business activities and connectivities are happening. So I think that's what's really exciting for edge. So blending edge and AI together, I think we're going to see first, like you said, Matt, all the data is still really disparate. So any networking solution that can tie that data together in a secure, seamless way and account for as best as possible performance anomalies with having all this scattered data and make it seem like one even plane of data is going to win in the first phase, because it's going to be, do you take the mountain to Moses or Moses to the mountain? People are going to want to take Moses to the mountain. It's going to be hard to move all of it to one central location. It's better to try to use a high performance network and a smart connectivity strategy to connect the data to the services that you need. But in that second generation, when we start to see this proliferation of more vendors beyond these big companies come out with chips, it's going to start to scatter and become heterogeneous. So you're going to see AI stuff pop up everywhere, because what you said earlier was true. It's really about moving it closer to the user. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see some of these big edge, like caching companies like Akamai and Cloudflare, and there's, other household names for these guys that start to say, maybe we should start doing some AI pods on our POPs. And any company, maybe even Megaport, that has tons of POPs and tons of great short visibility to the last mile, say, yeah, man, we should be hosting this AI stuff, right? Because it's twice as fast if it's out in Wyoming, where the certain user base is, than having to backhaul it all the way to Chicago, for example.
No, exactly right. I think it's all about sort of getting closer to the user. It's latency.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I think it really does come down to sort of cost. I think whoever sort of wins out there, it's a lot of the enterprises will have a mix and a blend. And I think they'll continue with that, particularly in the AI space. I don't think that they're going to put all their eggs in one basket. We've seen this. They've chosen one particular vendor, and then failure happens. And so there's these data lakes, and how do you bring these lakes together, as you sort of mentioned, Wei?
So Matt, what else is happening in the edge now that looks exciting or enticing from an innovation perspective? Because AI is important, but still it is in the early phases, and it feels still today like a buzzword, right? It's nothing that we see yet emerging as a solid pattern. And in fact, there is no pattern, because the networking people don't even know what the pattern looks like yet.
Exactly.
But there've got to be other things interesting happening that Megaport has helped change and revolutionize in the past, say, 3 to 4 years. So for example, how about this idea that some of the CSPs are finally figuring out that it makes sense to partner for private connectivity? So you've got Google now with this pattern. And again, my marketing brain escapes me, but they now will connect like layer one to all the other clouds. And they just kind of gave up on trying to be bespoke there and said, yeah, it just makes sense if we allow our backbone privately to connect to the other CSP backbones. Do you see that as a trend set, as an emerging pattern, something that's going to change the industry, or do you think it's an anomaly?
I don't think it's changing we're not sort of feeling it right now. I think that some of these cloud providers are trying to figure out themselves, how do I get closer to the user? And then how do they become a little bit stickier? However, I do think that they're struggling with being sort of vendor agnostic.
Mhm.
And then of course, how do they reach? Again, it's very costly even for Google to go out and build huge amounts of capacity, even though they invest in subsea cables, as you know. But you've got smaller providers like a Megaport or an Aviatrix that are a little bit more agile and a little bit more agnostic. And so for Megaport, we're just going to continue expanding. We're just going to continue investing in higher speeds and capacity. We're going to continue investing in, the ecosystem, the communities of interest. And that really hasn't changed for us since day one. And the simplification, I think that that's the hard part. You mentioned layer one on Google, like there is still a delay and there's still extreme complexity in configuration, even at the layer one level. And then how do you bring all of those networks together and manage those networks together? So I think that Google, they're doing a great job in expanding and providing that multi-cloud connectivity, but it's still, I would say, limited.
I think if you look at that, even from a layer one perspective and the ability to for Google reaching across the aisle, basically saying, hey, let's connect and make these happen. There's still a huge gap from a security perspective. Wouldn't you say, as far as, yep, I've got connectivity now between them. And yes, they're riding cloud backbones, but I am still responsible for that security of my data across that backbone.
Yeah. Matt, you talked about the simplicity aspect of it, and I couldn't agree more, which is why I think for those listeners that aren't aware, Aviatrix and Megaport have recently formed a wonderful partnership together to bring that kind of simplicity, out to the masses, out to the enterprises that really need it. I think that capability of being able to change a workflow that used to take weeks into days is critical. And then also providing just a seamless service overlay across a lot of these connectivity patterns is critical, especially in multi-cloud scenarios. Because again, even though, like you said, Google has and other clouds too, of course, Oracle is also well known for their layer one partnerships with their other clouds. So Google isn't unique, but that doesn't quite solve for world hunger. To your point, there's still a whole other layer of complexity that goes on top. How do you make sure all of the routes behave in the same way? How do you secure it from an even surface area? How do you have predictable traffic steering and routing mechanics? How do you troubleshoot and operate this construct, which is, under the covers wildly different? I see Aviatrix and Megaport as adding a tremendous amount of value there, from just time to value, time to market, being able to operationalize this stuff in a sane, rational way. I was curious about your comments on that and how you feel that the partnership might help our mutual customers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you mentioned earlier, like where is sort of Megaport going to play? And I think it's actually quite difficult to navigate. We could go out, as you mentioned, and compute ourselves at the edge. And we've actually done that, but we wanted to make sure that we kept to what our core business was, which was actually networking or private connectivity. So we're really good at sort of the underlay, right? We can take you from point A to point B, but we can't do that alone. We really need, customers are looking for complete end-to-end solutions. And so what we, believe in is building this rich ecosystem of services. And when we released the virtual edge product, it was, well, we could throw anything out there, but hang on a minute. We want to make sure we stick to our core, which was the networking. So we rolled out NFV capabilities and that compute at the edge just for NFV. So where that comes into play was, well, when we got talking to all of you over at Aviatrix, was we don't really know too much about security or, high encryption. And so for Megaport, it's, we run a layer 2 network. We also provide you layer 3 capabilities, but for those highly regulated industries, particularly where we've got some of those banking and financial service customers, we had a lot of those asking, well, we need to run an additional layer of security across your network. Who would you recommend? And wouldn't it be nice to have that easy button? And so that's where, we started deep diving with you all, and just hosting Aviatrix at the edge just made complete sense. And then, of course, where the synergies came into was, well, Aviatrix didn't really have an underlay. So your customers are looking for savings, right? Particularly when it comes to egress. And so, the integration with Aviatrix it's been extremely exciting to roll those out across all of our cities and metros. And particularly for banking customers and healthcare, like that's what they need. They need that easy button. And of course, Megaport is great at the cloud edge, but we don't really know and understand, nor do we really get into beyond the cloud edge. So the networking component within a VPC. And that's where you guys come into play, is providing that visibility and the monitoring, but at the end of the day, the simplification. And so together we're simplifying networking. And I think that's where it sort of comes down to it. Hopefully with our engineers, that API integration and continuing to mature the partnership will just make it even easier for customers to do, whether it's hybrid or multi-cloud.
Yeah, I think being a senior solutions engineer here and working with our customers, I think that's one of the more exciting pieces that I see, is that the more we integrate and the easier we make it for them to consume, both Megaport and Aviatrix. It just excites me because now we're going to make it that much easier for them to make that connection, make that high performance connection, and allow them to utilize whatever workloads it is, right? Whatever workloads are in the cloud versus on-prem.
I think it makes, and again, this really isn't a shameless marketing plug. It's not. And I know for some people listening, it might feel that way. But when you think about any business partnership between two companies, which two companies really jive together and really make sense together and really have compatible technology stacks that create a synergy? And that word synergy has been overused and beat to death, but it's true. Aviatrix and Megaport make a lot of sense. And I say that because we both understand the value of automation and agility and scale. I remember the Megaport Cloud Router coming out. I don't remember what year it was, because everything when I was at Azure was just compressed into this phenomenal blur of activity and wild West days. I'm going to take a guess. It was 2016. Do you remember, Matt?
Yeah. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, but
Right.
I think that, it was around that time.
Yeah.
I think that we were up on stage together quite a few times.
Yes.
Talking about networking, but yeah, I think it was around 2016.
Yeah. Well, someone will have to fact check me on this. I want to be accurate, but certainly from my position at that time, it was the first virtual edge networking device available outside of VMware, outside of like putting VMware to colo and running a virtual router. And it blew everyone away. People are like, holy shit, these guys have got a virtual router that's part of their edge fabric, and you just spin it up and connect to it, and it's all software. And I was like, man, Megaport did it first. And I was like, look out for these guys. Cause we had been doing a business together for, at that point, maybe a year and change or something. And I remember being on conversations with other carrier neutral facilities, other providers, and being like, have you guys seen the Megaport Cloud Router? Because that's pretty hot. Because before that, you had to cart your Cisco or Juniper in. You had to rent for the power and space and cooling. You had to pay a technician to cable it up. You had to pay a system integrator or a data center provider to care and feed for it and reboot it and all these things. And then Megaport Cloud Router came in. It was just like, just click this button and go boom, boom, and you're done. It was like this revelation of what Edge was going to be. From that perspective, it makes complete sense that our two companies work together.
Absolutely. I mean, Woody, what would you say is like What are you seeing like on the use cases between, with this newly formed partnership? Where have you sort of witnessed where it makes sense?
I'll actually let Jason take a crack at that because he's far more intimate with the sales funnel and customer activity than I am. I'm sitting in my little ivory tower, kind of back in product marketing. So what's happening on the ground, Jason?
So it's more of an echo chamber, really, because it really is the synergy between I use that word again, but it is that synergy between the ability for you guys to bring layer 2 and that connectivity and some of your layer 3 functionality, and the ability for us to come on top of that, utilize whatever circuit that is, right? Because we have high performance encryption and can actually take advantage of whatever circuit that is built from the customer's on-prem or from their Megaport circuit into the cloud, and then being able to put that encryption around it, right? And still being able to utilize that entire pipe. I think that is, and that is what I'm seeing from a regulatory perspective when you talk about healthcare and banks and insurance companies, those types of plays. So that's where we see the most uptick and the biggest use case for us making that connection Again, any type of encryption. I think a lot of enterprises appreciate the ability to encrypt their data in flight. So it doesn't have to necessarily just be the regulatory industry, but it is mostly, government, healthcare, those types. But we're definitely seeing a very good uptick in that use case using Megaport.
Yeah, well, the news from the ivory tower, I'm happy to report, is that what we see in marketing trends and in corporate trends are that most enterprises, like to your point, Matt, earlier, have gotten educated on private connectivity. They have at least one on-ramp, if not multiple ones. They've gotten their arms around this. And it's established now. People basically understand the patterns and best practices. But this was a Gen 1 effort. So now that cloud is really real and hybrid is really real, and I think business leaders have come to a better understanding of what applications are really suited for cloud and what applications are suited for hybrid. It was a tough learning curve. There was many bodies on the road, but everyone's kind of sorted it out, except for AI, which will leave more bodies, and then that'll be exciting. That'll be exciting, is that they're ready to modernize. They're like, okay, so we kind of got it sorted, like what really belongs to the cloud, what could we transform, what could we innovate on, what should be hybrid, what we should just is nuclear and we should never touch and just let it run on some mainframe for perpetuity and pay IBM or something. So they're ready for Gen 2 now. And what they want is they want to modernize their applications, they want to scale them, they want to use shift left, and they want to containerize more, they want to become more agile. And they want more data. They want, like you said, it's exactly why they're knocking on your door and saying, I want 100, I want 400. Because that modernization piece means they're ready for big time. They're ready for building bigger applications in cloud that can swallow petabytes and petabytes of data. So the cloud game has gotten, next level serious for those applications that are suited for it. And then hybrid has gotten next level serious because they have now balanced there and they have their sea legs on them and they know exactly how to leverage hybrid. So we're seeing this maturation of how to utilize all the tools and all the capabilities. Now everyone's comfortable. They bought the Ferrari. Now they're like, okay, I want to take it out on the racetrack and I want to redline this thing. I think it's
100%.
Yeah.
And I think what comes with that is the shift of enterprises are now looking at the networking component. They're laying that foundation, whereas 10 years ago, they weren't really thinking about the networking component. So they are thinking a little bit more ahead. Everyone thinking about networking? No. I mean, that's our jobs to educate the market about how important networking is, because it can be a real choke point for some of these enterprises. And so it's good that people are thinking a little bit more ahead.
Yeah.
Just to kind of come over the top on that one, I think there was an understanding, especially in the cloud before hybrid really became hybrid recently, that networking started to be really taken for granted. I mean, the cloud just had networking and everything just seemed to work. And as the
The internet just happens.
Yeah.
exactly,
It's just magic.
exactly. And as those applications grew more complicated in there and how they've changed and either lifted and shifted some applications that maybe shouldn't have been lifted and shifted, or applications that have been rebuilt and built on the layer 3 model, it got really complicated. And I think we're seeing that now, come to fruition. Like, okay, we can't take the network for advantage anymore. Now we have to really look at how we're building it and how it should be built, just like they were doing years ago in the data center, right? Like, okay, now we really need to figure out and plan for the best network experience possible.
Exactly right.
All right. Well, gentlemen, we could talk about this kind of stuff for
All day.
hours,
Yeah,
all day. But unfortunately, we have to keep it to some reasonable length so that our listeners don't tune out and start, getting back to their regular jobs, because hopefully this podcast is a little bit more than a welcome distraction to our listeners and provides them with a ton of interesting information and insights. And Matt, you were just phenomenal. Thank you for your information and wisdom and insights. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show today. And Jason, thanks for coming on the show and,
Of course,
adding a tremendous amount of flair and interest and all the cool knowledge and insights you have. So it was a true pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks for having me.
You bet.